Welcome to Education Talks. I'm David Burke. Terence Tan is a former teacher and now product manager at EdMaker in Singapore. In this episode of Education Talks, Terence reflects on his time working on policy initiatives with the Ministry of Education. He also discusses EdMaker's community lab Makerspace at United World College and a new PD approach to engage teachers with emerging technologies. Well, Terence, welcome to Education Talks. Great to have you. Where are you right now?
Well, I'm based in Singapore, and I'm with this company EdMaker. We're based in Singapore, but we have a couple of offices in India and the US. But Singapore is where I'm based, and I've been working here since 2016.
So can you tell us a little bit about your background in education prior to getting involved with EdMaker?
Sure. Yeah, it's funny. I think a lot of teachers, a lot of educators who join the sector, they have a single inspirational teacher. They have a great story about how they joined education because they had a inspirational teacher in high school. I'm a little bit different. I think a lot of my teachers when I was growing up were good, but it wasn't like a single one who really captivated me. So I kind of stumbled into this industry sort of by accident. After high school, I was kind of deciding where to go for college, for university, and then I really wanted to study overseas, study outside of Singapore. So I was looking at different scholarships because my parents were like, either you study in Singapore or if you want to go overseas, you got to find yourself like a scholarship. So I looked at different scholarships, and like today, most of the scholarships in Singapore are actually sponsored by the government. So I was asking myself, can I imagine doing these jobs, government jobs, for the next 5 to 10 years of my life, checking out the different jobs. And eventually I realized that for me, I didn't want a desk job. I didn't want to stay at my desk 24/7. It's for some people and that's great, but for me, I wanted something that could impact people's lives like directly and tangibly. Um, get on my feet for part of the day, really get into the trenches and start working. And so eventually it was a toss up between education and something like criminal or family law. And eventually I chose education as because there weren't that many overseas scholarships for law. So I was fortunate enough to get a scholarship to go to the US to study. I did an undergrad in NYU and a master's in the Harvard Graduate School of Education. We call it HUXI, and and it really was at HUXI that my eyes were open to the broad range of opportunities and impact that you could do in education. I think before that, a lot of my thought was like, oh, okay, well, education is really all about teaching. But after being there and seeing so many of my classmates who had come from different kind of backgrounds, from tech, from business, from even from being a management consultant, for instance, and how all of that comes together um, to kind of I wanna make a better life for the education sector. I wanna make a better life for students. How can my previous experience help me, and what do I want to do moving forward? Right? Apart from teaching, there are other opportunities, and I realized well, all these other opportunities create value for the sector. There's a value in doing it. So that's when I really started seeing oh, apart from teaching, how else can I get involved in the education sector? So I finished up my studies there. I came back and I taught for 2 years in a secondary school, in a high school, right? And this was a high school with a disproportionately high amount of low income students. So these students come from backgrounds that really meant that a lot of their priority wasn't in getting their homework done. It wasn't like getting food to put on the table for their families because their mom or dads might not be at home, right? Might be incarcerated or just working long hours. And I think this was super eye opening for me as someone who came from a much more privileged background. So I think that everyone who kind of wants to be in a sector should spend a few years teaching in an environment that's super different from the one they grew up, just because it opens your eyes up to challenge a lot of assumptions you had, and that's great for starting your career, right? To challenge yourself and to question oh, I thought things were this way, but actually it's not. So after 2 years teaching in that high school, I went to the ministry. And it was a I focus on higher education policy. So we were doing policy analysis and staffing senior civil servants or education ministers. And I was fortunate enough to work under bosses and directors who were quite deliberate in exposing me to quite a broad range of experiences. And I can talk a bit more about this later on, but it runs the gamut from like quantitative analysis to secretariat work, designing like broad conversations for a wide range of education stakeholders, that kind of stuff. So that was what I did at the ministry, policy level, high level stuff. And thereafter, I moved over to EdMaker, which is where I am right now.
Very good. I want to ask you, what was it like working for the Ministry of Education in Singapore at the beginning of the pandemic?
Yeah, so when I came in, it was definitely like a, I mean, a weird time is kind of an understatement, right? When I came in, like I mentioned before, I was in the higher education policy division, so we oversee the polytechnics and ITE, and some of our overseas listeners, these are like community colleges or vocational institutes. They are tertiary or higher education institutions in Singapore, but they have a lot of independence, right? And broadly speaking, our division has oversight of the polytechnics and the Institute of Technical Education. We call it ITE. So although these institutions have operational autonomy, where the ministry comes in as a set kind of like broad direction to help coordinate efforts between the different institutions, and also to ensure that their direction is broadly aligned with the ministry's goals. So I think when I first came in, it was in the early 2020, right? And it wasn't that rough, right? Early 2020, we were still like wondering what COVID was, and we
Mm.
had no idea about the kind of extent of impact it would have. So I entered in January 2020, right as the pandemic started. And generally in the ministry, the time you're taking to onboard yourself into a policy role is around 4 months, and everyone knows that. So during those 4 months, you're given a bit of time to really learn, and get into the thick of things. So you're learning more than contributing. So I wasn't trusted in the thick of things, but I remember like coming to the office at 9 and people were already there, like they were frantically like they had this look of like urgency in their face that I know what's going on, but like I'm involved in something that for now I can't tell anyone else because a lot of it was under wraps. So it was a definitely like a very unique situation I was in. Um and I also remember like leaving at 6 or 7 and people were staying in. And I was talking to them like, oh, aren't you going home? They're like, no, we're waiting for an email to come in,
Hmm.
tallying up contact tracing, and we're probably gonna stay till like 9 or 10. Um, and yeah, it was super surreal seeing that, like as someone who was new to the job, seeing that, oh, this is probably what things may become, right? But at that time, no one knew. Um, Fast forward to a few months in the pandemic, like April or May, we realized that it's not going to go away anytime soon, although none of us had at that time like any idea how long it would take. Um, but I think there was a collective understanding, right, as the pandemic drew on, that things must grow on, things must go on. We can't afford the kind of learning loss that has happened in other countries, right? So so the big question, right, for us was the how to balance a few kind of trade-offs, right, which is our bread and butter in policy making. So the big question was how do you balance like safety and security concerns, health concerns, with the need that students must continue learning. Your students can't. I mean, your education system can't like close down completely just because of the pandemic, right? It still has to go on. So the big question for us was how to make that happen. Um, and I think maybe I can give your listeners an example of how we tried to make that happen, right? Um, I was working on this admission scheme called early admissions exercise, and basically you can think of early admissions, we call EAE, right, for early admissions exercise. We can think of EAE as like an admissions that's based on a student's aptitude in certain specific disciplines. So for example, for an IT course in one of the polys, instead of looking at a student's O-level results, their standardized test, instead of that, you're looking at whether they have computational thinking skills, you're looking at how passionate they are based on kind of courses they've taken, whether they've taken part in hackathons, looking at their experiences in those hackathons, looking at their portfolios. So really a more holistic understanding of like why are you interested in this course and what do you want to get out of it, rather
Mhm.
than just looking at their exam results, which I think is a big part of the criticism
Mhm.
a lot of education systems in
Yeah.
Asia, right? That you're looking too much at exam results. We are trying to break past that. But of course, looking at their aptitude, looking at their portfolio is a more nuanced kind of look. And before the pandemic, we used to get students down to interview. We got students down to do like hands-on workshops, to take part in like boot camps to see how well they could participate in certain activities that were related to the course they were applying to. And of course, during the pandemic, like that was hard to do, right? So we needed to transition to online methods of selection, and these online methods, of course, cause some worry, right, amongst parents. Whether online selection is fair, is it rigorous? Do they do they like exacerbate issues of equity, right? So, for example, do students who don't have computers at home, who have poor internet connections, would they be unfairly penalized? Which I think are all fair, like, concerns. So, of course, we had to go back and look at the courses and then work with all the institutions to say, like, this course, like, for example, dentistry requires a lot of hands-on because you need to see how students are like, how their hand-eye coordination is. So you still have to have face-to-face aptitude tests because it's pretty hard to assess hand-eye coordination online. So we had to trash it out, right? And on top of that, you had to create like draw plans, what we call draw plans for different scenarios, because we have no idea how the situation would evolve. Things could get better, things could get worse. Um, so we have to create different scenarios for different. We have to create different draw plans for different scenarios, right? As the pandemic gets worse, you pull out the draw plan and say, okay, we have to pivot all of EAE admissions interviews to online. What would that look like, right? And if it gets slightly better, which are the courses which you would want to prioritize to have online interviews, right? And which of them would you absolutely need to have face to face? So the whole exercise was a great example of what we call first principles thinking, kind of like prioritizing the different considerations, what's your non-negotiables, and what you have a bit more wiggle room, and also how after you've done that whole thing out, how you communicate it to your stakeholders, how do you communicate it to your parents, to your lecturers, to your institutions who might have who might have um, um, huge concerns, right? And you want to be able to address their concerns. Yeah, so that was kind of example of how we tried to balance our trade-off between health and security concerns and trying to prevent learning loss.
Mhm.
Um, so I think as we move on in 2021, a lot of the policy reviews, which were initially deprioritized because of the pandemic, we realized that we have to continue with policy work, right? And I think even though these policies, we realize, policy work takes a long time to implement. The regular policy cycle is as long as 5 years in terms of reviewing, implementing, and that whole cycle takes around 5 years. But we realized we have to continue with it, right? So one of the reviews that I was involved in was called the review of pathways and opportunities in applied education. It was a huge review, right? It was led by a minister. In essence, it's the equivalent of a blue ribbon committee. You have all these senior level stakeholders, CEOs and senior management of different public sector, private sector, people sector companies coming in to try to deliberate about um, how you want to grow the sector, how you want to ensure that our higher education sector in the polys and ITE are relevant to the needs of students. And kind of like still meet their aspirations, right? So what's fit for purpose 10 years ago may not be fit for purpose now. We want to relook at that. So I was involved in a lot of secretariat work, and what that means was you ensure that everyone in the committee is kind of heard. You organize meetings for the committee. It requires a lot of diplomacy and finesse, a lot of people skills, a lot of stakeholder management skills to make sure that everyone's pleased and appeased, and everyone kind of like gets their say. Um, and I was also involved in a few big policy pieces related to that committee, related to that review, such as number one, how do you expand opportunities for deeper industry exposure? Um, including, say, industry immersion for different profiles of students. Say you're extremely passionate in this industry, how can we actually help you to get involved in a deeper way, right? For example, do you shadow senior management? Can you serve as a PA to one of the senior management for a few months? Exploring all of these opportunities for industry exposure, which previously were pretty ad hoc, right? And left up to the individual polytechnics. So we want to coordinate kind of like deeper industry exposure. So that's the first thing. And the second thing that we were looking at that I think was super interesting was how do you provide greater flexibility for polytechnic students? I think there's a lot of conversation going around in the West, at least, around a four-year college and the value of a four-year college. And I think a lot of that criticism is around, well, do you need 4 years to learn your curriculum, right? Which is related to the idea of personalized learning. How do you ensure that students go through courses in a way that is most attentive to their needs, right? If a student needs more time to graduate because they need a longer time to go through different modules, just because they might need a bit more time to understand the content, can we give them a bit more flexibility to go through that? So can we offer these personalized learning pathways for students to help meet their needs? And what are the resources that we would need? Is it worth it to invest in those resources just to cater for like 5% or 6% of students? So all these are hard questions that we really have to like deliberate around and kind of like calculate the policy trade-offs. So that was what we were doing in 2021. And I think that was also super interesting. So I think if you think about it, yeah, there was a lot
Mm,
which we had to grapple with
yeah.
during my 2 years there. Yeah.
What an experience. On reflection, what was the biggest challenge and perhaps the learning points from your time there?
So my biggest challenge, especially when I first came in, was kind of squaring the on-ground experience which I had in schools before against the policy exposure, which is at a high level, right? When you're a teacher, your focus is on your classroom. Your focus is on your students, right? And I'm sure all the teachers out there that they're listening to your podcast have at least one or two experiences of like, you make sacrifices for your kids, right? Um, you make sacrifices for your kids, even though it might affect sometimes your own mental well-being or your own kind of health. And seeing the kind of decisions that you have to make at a high level, seeing the kind of decisions that you have to make when you're in the policy departments. There were a couple of times where I was making recommendations where my instinct was like, well, if I was a teacher on the ground, I would hate it, right? Because there are some um, decisions that I have to make for the good of the health and security, which would place a greater burden on teachers, right? For contact tracing, um, for to ensure that students are taking the temperatures every day, things like that. As
Mm.
pedestrian as that may sound, that was important, but it would mean that there's a greater kind of like burden on the teachers. So I mean that was something that I was grappling with, and I feel like after a while you reconcile it, right? You reconcile it by having a kind of like a watertight policy rationale when you're proposing a policy, when you're making decisions that impact not just your classroom or your school, but it impacts like 100,000 students, like 50,000, I don't know, staff amongst all of the polytechnics and ITE. You want to have a very good reason why you're making certain decisions against others, right? Based on a set of criteria which everyone aligns on. So your decision making process has to be very thorough and it has to be very comprehensive, right? And then once you're secure with that, then after that communication is important. How you communicate your decisions down to your stakeholders is important, but that's a second order issue, right? You can't make decisions just because your stakeholders want to hear a certain set of things, right? You can't make decisions based on short-term gains. And I think it requires a certain set of, I guess, courage to be able to say that I think that this should be made for the better of the whole education fraternity, even if it means that, certain segments are gonna shoulder a bit more burden, and you have to do so in a way that like I guess people are okay with it, right? So that just reinforces the importance of, I guess, policy decision making, right? Um, so that was something that I was grappling with. That was something that in the first few months I was a little like unsure about. Um, But the biggest learning points, right? So I think the biggest learning points were three. The first one is about trade-offs. Like I mentioned just now, to be very clear what you're trading off against. Like all policy making is trade-offs. So you can't really just decide that I want to do this and have you can't have your cake and eat it too sometimes. You have to be what you have to be clear what you're trading off against, and you have to be clear what you can't trade off against. What's a non-negotiable. You have to be very clear about how to prioritize your decision making criteria, right? And I think that's something that's applicable in any job. So that's something that I found tremendously transferable. Um, the second thing is how do you manage people, right? How do you manage up to your bosses, um, to political office holders? How do you manage laterally to other people within the ministry who might have competing aims, who might have competing goals, objectives,
Mm.
to kind of try to find common ground with them. How do you manage down to people who might be reporting to you, informally or formally, right? And informally is a whole different ball game because sometimes these people may not be formally reporting to you, but you need to work with them. They're more junior to you, and you've been given a responsibility of trying to mentor them and kind of work with them to make sure their work is up to speed. How do you do that? So all of these like different experiences, managing different profiles of people, um, was something that I took away in a big way, and that's something that's tremendously transferable as well. And I think the third thing that I got out of is the importance of having internal processes, especially when you're managing a team, especially when you're trying to do operations. How it was so clear to me the institutions and the organizations and departments who have very clear internal processes do so much well when a crisis hits, right? Rather than those who don't have clear internal processes.
Yeah.
And even though COVID kind of showed us that you have to continually evolve these processes, um, it was quite clear to me that those departments who had stronger processes going in were able to modify them on the fly rather than those who just were super ad hoc about the way they did things. So I guess those three things were my biggest like learning points.
Yeah. I was in an international school in Singapore at the time when that kicked off, and I think that that communication piece and an explanation of why decisions were being made was very good. And also, I had the benefit of getting to become very good with Google Forms and spreadsheets as we were tracking people's travels at the start of the pandemic, which was not a positive way to look at things. But that's really interesting. Can you tell us a bit now about your current role at EdMaker?
Yeah, so current role at my current role at AdMaker, my formal title is a product manager, but in a small company, AdMaker, it's really anything that needs doing. My experience runs the gamut from like business development work, where we're looking for US partners um, to join us as we kind of like expand into the US. Um, we're doing a lot of product management. I'm doing a lot of product management because we have a project building STEM labs and STEAM labs in Ghana. So that's another piece that I have to manage. And I'm also working on our flagship new product called Eddie. So Eddie is short form for the Educator's Buddy, and it's a platform where teachers can help, which aims to help teachers infuse emerging technology into their classroom every day. So those are the some of the big things I'm currently in charge of and I'm working on in AdMaker. Yeah.
And recently, you invited me to your office, which is a community lab at UWC at Tampines in Singapore. Can you tell us about that space and how the partnership works?
Yeah, it's super interesting that we call it a community lab, and that's the way I've presented to you. But for listeners out there, it's essentially the you can think of it as a makerspace that's open to members of the community, and I think in many countries across the world, not just in Singapore, it's tremendously hard to sustain a makerspace just because the unit economics sometimes just don't make sense. It's super hard to make revenue to cover your overheads. But I think the community lab that we have in United World College is one model that I think is quite sustainable in how we run a makerspace. Just to give you a bit of background, the lab started off in 2016 as United World College wanted to develop a makerspace, but have it a little bit different from the current design and technology lab. So they have a couple of design technology labs, but they wanted the makerspace to be different. They wanted it to be a place where students and members of the community can come in to tinker on projects. They wanted it to be very ground up and organic. They didn't want it to be run by run top down by the school, right? And they also wanted to, and this was done very explicitly. They wanted to bring in the community, the surrounding community. I think one recognition is that, and Dave, you would also be familiar with this point, that sometimes international schools, by very nature of the reason for their existence, they can be a little insulated and separated from the communities that they're embedded in. And I think UWC had a very v- they were very deliberate that they didn't want this to happen for their makerspace, so they wanted to make it a more inclusive environment. So when AppMaker spoke to them, well, what we said was that, well, one of the programs that we have is called Repair Kopitiam, and Kopitiam is I mean vernacular in Singapore for a coffee shop, right, where people come to hang out, people come to like eat, to talk to their friends, to drink a cup of coffee, and chat about anything under the sun. And that was the kind of like program that we were running, where people could bring in their spoiled or non-functioning consumer electrical goods, come down, tinker with it with your friends, learn from some of our experienced repair coaches on an informal basis, right? They pick up a new skill, and they can use that skill whenever a consumer appliance in your house breaks down. So that's a skill that we thought that UWC stakeholders, such as the students and their teachers and their parents, would be interested in, right? And we thought that's a skill that might be useful for them. And UWC said, "Wow, that's a wonderful program. Let's bring it on board." And we came on board to run Repair Kopitiam workshops with parents, with their teachers, even with their students. So they had a lot of fun. And from there on, we kind of deepen our engagement with the community. So currently, we run programs such as Open Lab Fridays, where we open a community lab to their stakeholders, and we run programs. Right. One of the programs that we ran previously was about exposing community lab visitors to augmented reality and virtual reality. So we have a bunch of Google Cardboard, and a lot of what AppMaker does is also an emerging technology. So we're in a pretty good position to try to translate some of that into our open lab programs. So students come down, they got to play around with like AR and VR and other emerging technologies. It's a whole lot of fun. And then we also like share with teachers how they can actually help to integrate it in their classrooms. We give them professional development support if in the case that they want to infuse emerging tech into their curriculum. And that's all done on a very informal level, because we've built up a level of trust where they're trusting us to actually come in to be that informal support for their teachers and for their staff. So I think we see it as a win-win-win. So we get a makerspace, right? And to some extent, we are shielded from the crazy expensive rents that's hitting everywhere in Singapore right now.
Hmm.
We give back to the UWC community through organizing all of these programs for the students, teachers, and parents. And UWC gets to fulfill the mission, right, of being a bit more inclusive, being a bit more open to their community. Yeah, and it's super symbiotic. That's a kind of symbiotic relationship that we wanted to promote when we started the lab.
Yeah, it's an impressive facility, and I think that sort of model is something that a lot of international schools really should be looking into. What is something you're working on now that you're excited about?
So something I'm working on now, and this is super new. This is hot off the press. We're literally launching our beta today. It's Eddie. I think I mentioned it previously before. The name of our product is Eddie, short form for the Educator's Buddy. And what it is a new professional development approach and product aimed at empowering teachers to teach with emerging technology, right? So I think a lot of times teachers think of emerging tech as something like an after school program. I'm going to introduce it to my students after school. But what we're saying is that, well, your students are going to grow up with this emerging technology around them, right? When they grow up to enter the workforce, it's not going to be emerging technology anymore. It's just going to be technology or like their lives, right? Why not get themselves familiar with it, familiarize the students with it to prepare themselves better for the future. And I think a lot of teachers, understandably, their response is, we have a lot of things to do: administrative work, classroom teaching, lesson prep. And you know what, I get that, right? I was once in their shoes. And so what we're doing is we're compiling a whole set of resources. We're developing a whole set of resources in-house to provide education resources for teachers to let them know how to integrate emerging technology into their own academic classes, right? So these are like lesson plans, um, technology tutorials, instructional strategies, to really get them to say, oh, well, I could try this out. I could try this lesson plan. I don't need to be super familiar with the technology. I just need to be game enough to take it and try to implement it in my classroom. And that's what we kind of want to change, right? So our beta is kind of like the first step in doing that. It's not perfect. There are a lot of kinks to iron out, but it's a start, right? And the other thing is we'd love to work with teachers and educators who are interested in this. I think as an edtech company, our as an edtech company catering to teachers, right? We live and die on the support of our users, right? So we want to hear from teachers and we want to hear from educators about what they find useful about it, what they don't find useful,
Mhm.
what they might like to see on it, right? So we would love to hear from teachers who have the same kind of passion. Yeah. So if any of your listeners are interested, yeah, feel free to reach out.
Brilliant. I can imagine a lot of people being very interested in that. And the little bit that I saw the other week, yeah, I think you're onto something. It's looking really good. Now, you also recently presented on the topic demystifying AI for primary school students. Can you share some thoughts on that topic just quickly?
Yeah, I was actually invited to share with a bunch of local teachers about that as part of our outreach efforts for Eddie. Um, there's this, I guess, a ground up nonprofit grassroots kind of initiative called String. So there's a shout out to String. If you're interested in how technology can be used in education, they're a great resource. They're a great group of teachers in public schools in Singapore who are constantly kind of pushing the boundaries. So I strongly encourage you to check out their socials and their blog. But what they did was they invited me to talk to some of the teachers on this topic, and this is a topic that's actually kind of quite close to my heart, um, as an educator. So what EdMaker does is we carry out um, ed tech training, right? Like I mentioned, in emerging technology for teachers. And one of the things that we did was we thought, how can we bring in some of this emerging technology down to the primary school level, right? I think the further you go from university, the further you go down along the so-called education chain, right, down to primary school and preschool, it's sometimes harder for us to envision how emerging technology can be applied to students who are so young, right, 10 or 11. But I wanted to show an example of how we managed to do it, and to show teachers that if we can do it, I'm giving everyone the resources so that you can do it too in your classroom. What we did was we used a couple of freeware programs. One of it is Machine Learning for Kids, which is a web app that allows you to train your own machine learning model online. And we did computer vision. We help students develop their own computer vision machine learning models, and we operationalize it in Scratch, right? And as most of you, as some of you might know, Scratch is a coding program, a block coding program developed by MIT. Again, it's free to use, and one of the affordances of Scratch is it allows you to run machine learning commands. So you can develop an app in Scratch that, for example, helps you detect when you have a bad posture. That's one of the projects that the kids came up with, right? Problem statement is that, well, a lot of the teachers and a lot of their friends have terrible posture, so they want to create a machine
Including me
learning
right
model.
now. Sorry, I'll
Yeah,
stop.
I know. I'm like hunching all the time. So it would be like, it would flash a set of words saying, well, you gotta sit up straight if the webcam detects that you're hunching over, and like it would say, well done if you're sitting up straight. So I thought that was just amazing, right? They're using AI to help to solve problems that they see in their environment. So I thought that's something that's super worth sharing. So I can give the resources and the link to the webinar for your
Yep.
listeners as well. They can check it out.
Brilliant. Yeah, if people want to get in touch with you, how can they go about doing that?
So they can get in touch with me. Drop me an email at terence@maker.com. That's TERENCE at maker. That's EDM8KER. Yeah, it's eight like the number. So they can drop me an email or they can just message me on LinkedIn. I'm free to chat, open to chat with anyone who kind of has the same vision. Because we know that kind of like this journey in edtech is not is it's hard to do it alone, and it's so much easier once you've had a community of people along the ride and on the journey.
Absolutely. Look, Terence, it's been fantastic to have you here on Education Talks. Really looking forward to keeping in touch and seeing how things go with Eddie and all sorts of things. Really appreciate your time. Thank you very much, and perhaps see you in the future.
Thanks so much, Dave.
Education Talks is an Ed Events production for the Ed Events community. You can keep up to date with the development of the community by registering on the website at ed.events.